Hello everyone, welcome back for another lesson. In this lesson, we will be talking about heredity. So, what is heredity? It's the passing down of traits from one generation to another. So we do that through our genes. Now, the man who's credited as the father of genetics is Gregor Mendel. So he was an Austrian monk. As you can see here, he lived in the in the 1800s, and he took an interest in plants. He loved to garden, and he noticed that some traits were repeating themselves. There was a pattern when he would reproduce plants from year to year. So he thought there might be something there, and so he started studying plants, and basically that was the first steps towards what we know now as genetics and heredity. So he's credited as being the father of genetics because of his studies of plants and how genes were passed on from generation to generation. So what did he do? He used pea plants. Why? Because they self-pollinate. They have within the flower both the male and female reproductive organs. So by taking one type of pea plant, which keeps reproducing with itself, it creates a pure line. So it says it's pure. There's no change in the character traits of that plant. It's the same traits that keep getting passed on from generation to generation. It's a perfect, pure line. So the offspring have the same trait without variation, again from generation to generation. So he started with that, and then what he did he took two different pure lines, one that had white flowers and one that had purple flowers, and he bred them together. We call that crossbreeding. So we have crossbreeding when there's an exchange of gametes, which are reproductive cells, between two individuals. And in order to have that, we have to have sexual reproduction. So that creates what we call a hybrid offspring. So a hybrid is a mixture of two different parents. So that does not produce a pure line. It produces a hybrid. So you have it as an illustration here. So he took a purple flower plant and a white flowered plant, and he crossed them together. So that's crossbreeding. His first generation, called F1, he got only purple flowers. Now he took, as a second generation, he took these purple flowers, the F1 flowers, and he crossbred them together. And what he obtained then was a ratio of 3 purple flowers to 1 white flower. And that's when he discovered essentially that there are genes that sometimes get expressed, sometimes they don't. So he essentially discovered recessive genes versus dominant genes. Now, why is it that we have dominant and recessive genes? Well, we have to talk about alleles. So alleles are possible forms of a gene. If you think of eye color, there's various colors for eyes. There's blue, there's gray, there's green, there's brown, there's everything else in between. So there's different alleles, different version of that gene that can code for a different color. Now we carry more than one gene, more than one allele. We actually carry 2 or more because sometimes there's several genes that will code for the same trait, but at least 2 anyways. So if you look at the chromosomes here, so let's say we take the father, the paternal chromosome. It looks like this, the X shape. It could have, for example, eye color, an eye gene over here, and another gene here for the eye color. The mother will have the same thing. So it has 1 allele, 2 alleles. Now, when we create reproductive cells, what happens is the following. So we have our chromosomes that get essentially split in 2. Okay, so only half gets passed on. So half from the father, half from the mother. So let's say this half gets passed on and this half gets passed on. Well, we get then our own set of chromosomes. So half came from the father, half came from the mother, for example. Now, depending on the alleles, so the versions of the genes that get passed on, it could be that we'll have 2 dominant genes, and we label dominant genes with capital letters. So capital B, it's dominant, dominant. So it could be that we'll have 2 dominant genes. It could be that we'll have 2 recessive genes. So lowercase is used for a recessive virgin, so a recessive allele. So we could have recessive, recessive, or we could have dominant and recessive. Now, if both are the same, whether they're dominant or recessive, it doesn't matter. But if they're both the same, we'll call this individual homozygous. If both are different, so one is dominant, one is recessive, we'll call this individual heterozygous. Okay, so a homozygote is an individual with two identical alleles, and a heterozygote is an individual with different alleles. And if we have both, so if we have a heterozygous individual, well, it's always the dominant allele that will get expressed. In other words, that as an individual, your character traits will be dictated by these dominant alleles, unless you have recessive. Okay, we'll get in the next lesson. I'll show you how to predict what the outcome would be depending on the genes that are passed on. So the dominant allele gets expressed, the recessive one gets repressed unless you have two recessive genes, two recessive alleles. Now this leads me to genotype versus phenotype. So the genotype is the individual's alleles, so all the genes that get passed on. Oops, I'm missing a period here. The phenotype is the appearance or the state of the individual for one or more character traits based on their genotype. So the genotype, it's all the genes, and those genes get expressed, so they get translated into your physical appearance, your personality, the way your body works, so in other words, a metabolism. That's called the phenotype. So the outcome is the phenotype. If we look at an example here of how genotype and phenotype are related in terms of height of a plant, let's say the genotype is capital T, so the capital letter is always for the dominant trait. In this case, it's tall. So capital T will have a tall individual. So the genotype is capital T, but the phenotype translates into a tall plant. Because both alleles are the same, we have a homozygous individual. If we have capital T with lowercase t, so this over here, two different alleles, will have a heterozygous individual because they are different alleles. But because there is a capital T, the individual will be tall. Here we have lowercase t. Because both are the same, again, we have a homozygous individual. But because both are lowercase or recessive traits, recessive alleles, in this case, the individual will not be tall, it'll be short. So we call it dwarf. Okay, so it's going to be a dwarf plant. So genotype, it's our genes. Phenotype is the outcome based on the genes. Okay, so that's it for the basics of heredity. In the next lesson, I'll show you how to predict what the offspring would look like based on the parent's genetic code. So that's it for now. If you have questions, please don't be shy and ask them. And otherwise, I'll see you around for your next lesson. And until then, take care.